Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to the latest installment in the Black Hat Webcast series, a surprise trip to Zero Trust Land, brought to you by Black Hat, Ping Identity, and Informa. My name is Steve Paul. I'm with Black Hat. I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and our presenters, and later in the program we'll ask for your feedback. We strongly encourage participation and are happy to take your questions and comments. You can participate in our Q&A session by asking questions at any time. Just type them into the Ask a Question text box in the bottom left of our console. We'll answer as many questions as time permits after the presentation. Slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and PDF copies of the presentation can be found in the bottom of your console under the resource links. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the Help question mark icon on the bottom right of our console. If slides are not advancing, please press the F5 key on your keyboard to refresh your browser. And now on to our presentation, a surprise trip to Zero Trust Land. Discussing today's topic will be Wendy Nather, head of the advisory CISOs team, Dual Security at CISCO. We also have our sponsor presenter, Amin, CTO of Ping Identity. First, we'll hear from Wendy.
Thank you so much, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm going to describe an experience that probably a lot of you can identify with right about now. It used to be that you had a strategic plan for organization, you had your security program all planned out in your projects, and suddenly you were notified that your flight is being diverted. Guess what? Instead of having this nice rash guard swimsuit, suddenly you're going to need a parka. And instead of those euros that you've been stocking up, you found out now that you're going to need some Canadian dollars. Sorry about that. You had some fabulous shoes that you were going to wear on your vacation, and all of a sudden you find out that you're going to need hiking boots. And instead of sun cream, you're going to need, wait, what is that? That is a bear-proof cooler. So you're probably asking yourself, what in the world is going on? Suddenly you need, for all of your people, remote connectivity for everybody, not just your admin users and not just a few remote access people. You need it for everybody. And this needs to happen no matter what they're using and where they are, and without relying on physical access or verification. This is something that we've always kind of assumed was available. You could go into the office and get your ID or pick up a token or whatever. You can't do that anymore. And in the meanwhile, the attackers are sniffing hungrily at all of the tents around you. So what does this mean? Guess what? Welcome to Zero Trust Land. Now, by the way, I know a lot of you are more familiar with the older version of Fantasy Island, but I kind of like this 90s version because I think Malcolm McDowell looks a little bit more sinister than Ricardo Montalban did. And it is a little bit scary. So guess what? Surprise, you're going to Zero Trust Land. Zero Trust Land is where the risk is greater because your attack surface has suddenly just increased by a whole lot. There are fewer viable options. Like I mentioned before, you can't rely on physical access or proximity to be able to do some of the things that you needed to do. Supply chains are breaking down. I don't know if you've tried to get a new laptop these days, but I know a lot of organizations are having trouble getting the kit that their employees need. The timeline and the future are unknown. This is not like a natural disaster where a hurricane passes through. We know it's going to be done. This is something where we don't know how long this is going to go on, what's going to happen, what other things might pop up to complicate it. And you remember the old joke about the hikers, and the hiker says, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun the other hiker. I'm here to tell you that that's not the case anymore. Thanks to automation in attacks, there is more than enough bear to go around. Sorry about that. So what is zero trust anyway? It has actually been around as a concept for a long time, almost 20 years ago now. The Jericho Forum, a bunch of financial institution CISOs in the UK, came together and talked about what they called deperimeterization. And as you can tell, deperimeterization is such a hard word to say. It's so long it doesn't even fit on this slide on one line. So that's my theory as to why it never really caught on. But they did talk about the concept of treating everything as if it were exposed to the open internet and securing it accordingly. Around about 2009, John Kindervag, when he was an analyst at Forrester, started describing it as a zero trust model, and that's the term that kind of stuck. Now, Google started implementing this internally, and it took them several years and hundreds of engineers, but they have come out in the meantime with a great series of white papers. In case you haven't read them, I think there are 7 or 8 of them now, describing how they implemented it, and they called their concept Beyond Corp. So there are so many different terms for zero trust, and I know a lot of people don't necessarily like this term. A lot of CISOs feel as though this is talking about not being able to trust your employees, and let's face it, you have to trust them to a certain extent so they can get their work done. So you can call it what you want. Actually, my favorite new term that I learned recently is from a book by Chase Cunningham, who is the principal analyst at Forrester these days, who is championing zero trust, except in his book here, he calls it edge and entity security. And I find that that's a lot more palatable to a lot of people, and it makes sense because this is how we're adapting. No matter what you call it, maybe there's a way we can agree on basic first principles. How about let's just agree that you shouldn't trust something just because it's on the inside of your firewall. We've seen a lot of breaches where that led to a problem, whether it's, there's a case, a really good one that was written up by the state of Colorado where they suffered a breach because a developer set up a cloud instance outside and it was only supposed to be temporary, so they didn't really secure it. And it took, after about 40,000 brute force attacks, the attacker managed to guess the admin password. And the problem is this instance was joined to the internal domain at the Colorado Department of Transportation. So in other words, it was trusted, and that's how the problem started. It led to a big ransomware attack. As I mentioned, they wrote it up really well. You can find their public papers on this. So if you can't trust something just because it's on the inside of your firewall, what do we do now? I'm going to propose that whatever you want to call the new perimeter, it's really any place where you make an access control decision. So this access control decision might still be made on the network layer. It might still be at the firewall, but it could be other places too. It could be at the operating system layer, at the middleware layer, at the application layer. It actually might be several of those things because you don't want to rely on just one thing. So if the perimeter is any place where you make an access control decision, what is this going to look like? I'm going to use my favorite analogy here. If you come up with a better one, let me know. But this seems to resonate a lot with my salespeople. I don't know why. Let's pretend that you're in a club and there's a bouncer at the door and the bouncer is the firewall. And the bouncer's letting people in and you're the bartender and someone comes up to you and says, I want to access your resource. I want to get a drink. What you say to them is, look, I don't care why the bouncer let you in. If you want to access my resource, you're going to have to show me some ID because that's my access policy. So you're putting the policies right up as close as you can to the point of access, and you're not relying on other points of access and decision makers to make the whole access decision for you, because who knows why the bouncer's letting people in. Or maybe you're a bouncer or you're a bartender and your bar is out on the patio and nobody ever sees the bouncer. That's kind of what like SaaS is, isn't it? So you want to enforce your policies as close as possible to the point of access. And they are going to vary based on the criticality of the resource that you're guarding. So like I said, let me know if this analogy works for you. I find it's a great way to describe to people in short form how the principle is different. Now, what controls are we using with this model? A lot of them sound very familiar. We talk about defined roles and segmentation, which is really, a version of least privilege. We talk a lot about multi-factor authentication. We emphasize endpoint security, even more than we used to. And we talk about continuous monitoring. Well, some people talk about continuous monitoring. I know that this is a thing that, for example, Gartner describes with their CARTA model. I don't know personally of many organizations that have the people to do real continuous monitoring at the logging depth that they need to, just because this is very hard to do. But let's leave that for now. Let's just say you monitor a lot. How's that? So what's the difference now? A lot of these principles have been around, like least privilege. The difference is sometimes technology. So, for example, we are describing now micro-segmentation at the network layer with new technology. You'll find a lot of products out there that are offering that. But another really interesting concept point, which again, I believe an analyst at Gartner first mentioned, is the concept of authenticating first before you connect. In other words, you don't let somebody just run wild over your network and look for a place where they can authenticate. They've got to authenticate before they can even see the rest of the network. And so that is a difference now that we are following with Zero Trust. With multi-factor authentication, again, we've had that for a really long time. I found an old RSA hard token in my garage from 25 years ago. It's been around. What's the difference? First of all, we're going to do it for everybody this time. It shouldn't just be for administrative users, other types of privileged users, or for remote users. It needs to be for everybody, because attackers are going after any set of credentials that they can, even if they don't have access to very much, and then they're going to try to see if they can escalate their privileges and move laterally within the network. So it's got to be for everybody across the board. We need more factors, and more factors are available now, and more flexibility. We need to be able to help people who cannot get a cellular signal in a particular building, or, for example, somebody came to me and asked me, how would you do two-factor authentication in a sterile operating room? Which is a really interesting problem. If you can't just sterilize a hard token, you can't tattoo a QR code on the back of somebody's neck, you can't use retinal scans because they're wearing safety goggles, all of that. Face ID is not working as well when you're wearing a mask. We have to, and we are putting in more factors. But one of the important things is, yes, sometimes you still have to rely on an IP address or a MAC address as part of the authentication, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you rely on anymore. Another difference in endpoint security, especially now, is that you can't assume that the device is corporate owned and managed. There are a lot of organizations who could not get enough equipment for their people to work remotely and just said, look, use whatever you've got. You have to be able to check at every authentication, not just once. You can't just register an endpoint and say, okay, we're good now. You've got to check and see who's using it and you may need to look at where it is, especially if you have regulatory issues that you need to comply with that are based on geolocation. But what you can do, even if you can't manage the device, is you can make the access contingent on compliance. And by this I mean, now we do have the ability to look at the security state of an endpoint, even if we're not managing it, even if we've never seen it before, and say, look, you can do what you want with your laptop on your own time, but if you want to access our resources, you're going to have to meet certain security requirements. You've got to have your software up to date. You've got to use disk encryption. You have to have lock screen enabled, that sort of thing. So it's more of a collaborative position that the org can be at now and say to the users, we can't always control what you're using, but we do enforce policies on the security state of that, and you're going to have to meet them if you want to access our resources. The other cool thing that really helps is being able to bind the user directly to. So you can't say that any user with the right credentials can use any of the corporate devices. They have to use that assigned device. So if you put all these 3 things together, or 4 things, a number of factors together, if you say that somebody has to have the right credentials and they have multi-factor authentication, let's say it's an app on a phone, and they have to be using the right laptop, it's no longer the case that an attacker can silently steal credentials and then come in from someplace else. They would have to steal the particular phone that was using that app. They would have to steal the laptop. And when hardware starts to go missing, people start to notice. So it makes it much, much harder for the attacker to get in once you can do this sort of thing with endpoint security. Continuous monitoring, again, not just at every authentication time, but there's a lot of work being done with behavioral analytics. You may see a user who was authenticated properly doing something with resources that they're not supposed to be doing. Either you made a mistake when you authenticated them and you thought it was really them and it wasn't, or it's an insider threat. But either way, you're going to look at their behavior, and then you might want to step up the authentication. You might want to say, look, this is looking kind of funny. We're just going to ask you for some other things now to make sure that you really are who you say you are. So that option of doing authentication at different times is another thing that is relatively new and that helps us a lot with Zero Trust. Here are some more differences. It used to be that we would kind of assume that an IP address was a geolocation. We would say, if you're coming from this, this IP address, you're in this network range, we're going to assume you're in the office building. We've known for a long time that we can't do that. We know that IP addresses can be spoofed. So if we don't know where they are from the IP address, how else can we figure this out? Well, we have GPS now. I remember in the mid-90s trying to play around with access-based, with location-based access control, and it didn't work very well because the GPS receivers were not as good and you had to hold them out the window and all that kind of stuff. But we have GPS now readily available. Another thing that we're doing differently is we're also taking workloads and workplace devices into account, not just user-driven devices, but of industrial control systems, IoT, medical devices, and so on. Workloads that are being used either in the private cloud or the public cloud. Again, we're expanding beyond just users and their own devices. There are more secure enclaves and trusted computing modules that we can leverage for some of these operations. And surprise, users have been getting cranky with all of this authentication, and the experience actually carries more weight now. So we are relying more on mobile. We're having more users who are insisting on being able to use the form factor that they're most comfortable with. And usually these are your trickiest users, your highest status users, your C-suite, your professors, your doctors, or whatever. We're using more single sign-on, which is great. And we have emerging standards like WebAuthn. Web authentication and CTAP2 are leading us down the road to something we've been hoping for a long time, and it looks like we might actually be able to accomplish it, which is passwordless. Now, that's going to be a different webinar altogether, but I'm here to say that because of all of these things, we are tightening up on the weaknesses around credentials, and we're adding more factors, we're making them more flexible for the user experience, and passwordless is definitely going to be a big part of this. So, you know, what does this mean? You might have already planned to use a zero trust model in your organization, or you might just have been caught by surprise by this flight diversion and you've been throwing things in and trying to figure out, what do you do now? I'm here to tell you that if you're doing one or more of the things on this list, if you're inspecting devices and their security state at authentication time, if you're using MDM, or if you're not, if you're able to use some of the other technologies to look at unmanaged devices, if you're using least privilege segmentation, single sign-on, if you're using encryption everywhere, and you know, even if you have a reverse proxy already in operation, and if you're doing any or all of these, regardless of the location, if you're even using them inside of your corporate network, first of all, you're giving your users a more consistent experience across the board. They don't have to remember, oh, wait, this is an internal application, I got to get on the VPN. Oh, wait, this is outside, this is SAST. I really need to go back into the corporate infrastructure and then come back out again. If you're doing everything, regardless of location, then guess what? Zero trust. You're soaking in it. Now that everybody can take a break and realize that they are probably doing some version of zero trust already, I'm going to hand this back to Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I certainly trust you very much. So thank you for an excellent job.
Thank you. I trust you too. But I'm going to have to see some ID.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. And guess what? We also trust Babar Amin of Ping Identity, and so we're going to hear from him as well. Over to you, Babar.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Wendy. That was excellent. So, folks, as Wendy stated, that there is now an acknowledgement on how we think about security, right? We don't rely anymore on locality. We don't rely on discrete events. We don't rely on static events. Instead, every device, every user, every network flow, everything must be identified, authenticated, and authorized at the granular level, right? Which also means that there is, that whole concept of insiders versus outsiders goes away, right? And also the static nature of trust goes away, right? Policies, they must be dynamic, right? They must be calculated in real time. So the policies cannot have predefined rules in them, but instead that calculation and that rule might even be dynamically generated from as many sources of data as possible in that particular circumstance. So where do we start then? Well, first, let's simplify a little bit, right? The two key principles that Wendy highlighted and that I'm going to talk about here also is really that zero trust, first of all, is a move from a static notion of trust assigned at a discrete time, right? Which that discrete time used to be authentication. Oh, I've authenticated, so I've been given trust, right? You make that more dynamic, which means that it shifts, it changes, right, based on the risk associated. The next the next key principle here is that you reduce the boundary where this trust is applicable, right? And you take it down ideally to an individual resource level. So, the old mechanism of build a moat, build a gate, build a fence, right? You move away from that and you take it ideally down to an individual resource, to an individual data element, to an individual process element, and as far as you can, right? And it is a journey, it is a path. You don't have to do everything to claim zero trust, like Wendy was just saying. You might already be doing portions of this. So that brings us actually to two new concepts. The first one, I like to call it, is digital trust versus what was static trust, what it used to be. So what is digital trust? Well, it is dynamic. It is not tied to any kind of ownership of control, meaning it should not rely on the ownership of the accessing device or control over accessing device, such as via MDM. And lastly, most important part of digital trust is that it is ephemeral, right? Which means that it should only be used for the minimal amount of time and for the purpose it was intended for. But that's really important. And Wendy and I were talking earlier today that zero trust is kind of it's a catchy term, but it's also disrespectful to some degree. And Chase Cunningham from Forrester has really been calling it edge and entity security, right? I call that ephemeral trust rather than zero trust because for this reason, that it should be down to an individual resource level, and it should be minimal for the amount of time and for the purpose it was intended for. But there is another side to this, which is the flip side of this coin, right? Which is digital risk. So it is a variable level of confidence, and again, it is a move from being static to dynamic. So both of these things are moving from a static concept to a dynamic concept. The other aspect here is that this digital risk is assigned by matching what my risk tolerance is to the trust that was assigned to the subject. So what it also does is this concept also allows you to separate the assignment of risk and the assignment of trust. They don't have to be the same team. They don't have to be the same people. The risk is assigned by the resource owners, which say, I need this level of assurance before I will grant access. And then your authentication systems and your verification systems are responsible for granting and creating enough data points so that that level of credentialing or that level of trust is achieved before you will be granted access to that particular resource. So what that means is zero trust is really a journey, right? And it's a process. It is not a destination. It also relies heavily on a concept called defense in depth, which means that it's not, you just can't deploy one thing. There's no silver bullet and just say that it is zero trust. So where do we start, right? So we should always start with identification and authentication. First rule, right? No unauthenticated packet touches the wire, right? So to authenticate, you must identify. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you will do the most secure authentication for a bad actor. So centralize, normalize, and externalize your identification and authentication, right? Don't do it in a per application basis. Next, we start looking at authorization. This has two flavors. One is at the web level, and the second is at the API level, and also goes to an individual transaction level. The key here is that they both need to be dynamic and contextual. And you see this theme that comes through, which is making things more dynamic, making things more contextual, because this is another thing we just talked about earlier. Wendy and I, and we said we both use the same example. If you're trying to access the cafeteria menu to see what's for lunch, then you don't need to give me 6 different ways of credentials and authenticate to me multiple ways just to read the cafeteria menu. But if you are looking at your CRM system or your customer list or source code or other intellectual property or finances for the company, well, you know, I'm going to need a little bit more information from you at that point, right? So, you know, that means that I start looking at authorization and I make sure that it is dynamic, right? It is based on context, context being what are you trying to do? And then lastly, you should be tackling security at the data level, right? So this applies to data at rest, data in motion, but also allows around the granting of access to data, right? So just as the first step was externalize authentication and identification, here you externalize authorization decisions, right? That way you take the authorization decision away from the application, away from the data itself, and centralize it so that you can modify them so without having to change applications. This is also where your specific data privacy regulations come into scope also, right? And those should always be applied in a consistent manner because otherwise you're gonna get the whole company in trouble. So who are we and what are our zero trust recommendations, right? It's not a silver bullet. You've heard, you know, the abstract concepts, and you've heard that, you know, it's not easy to solve. So who are we? Why are we telling you about this? And what is our recommendation? So a little bit of a plug, right? We're Ping Identity. We focus on two things. We focus on identity and access controls. That means we focus on authentication, identification, single sign-on, and controlling your access at all the different layers, and then making sure that you have a consolidated data layer. We also focus on making things simpler, and the reason is that our customers are large multinational customers that have complex ecosystems and complex heterogeneous products already deployed that need to be simplified because security is complicated as is, and if you don't know how your policy is going to work through the system, then you will have a hole, right? So simple security is always best security. So we serve the top organizations, as you can see, pretty much the who's who. So what do we recommend, right? Well, first of all, fix your authentication, right? Go back to the basics. Fix your authentication, fix your identification. What does that mean? Make it central, right? It's not that it's broken, but you want to make it better. So make it central. Make sure that it is flexible. Make sure that it supports and promotes standards, right? That is important because you have all these different new technologies and capabilities coming in, like we talked about WebAuth 10, right? So if you're not supporting standards, if you're not supporting the emerging common ways of doing authentication and identification, then you're going to either be left behind or be constantly changing things. Make sure that your services, your authentication service, is pluggable and extensible for the same reason. And then make sure that it can support all of your current and future application needs, right? So means that it should grow with you and it should adapt to your needs, not the other way around, not force you to adapt to security. That's the old way of thinking. That's what got us in trouble, because the minute you ask people to adapt to security, they will find a way around it. So make sure that it adapts to your needs. Second, leverage all possible risk signals available, right? And see what I said? I said all possible risk signals. That doesn't mean that you should say, I need 20 signals and I can't do anything until I have all the 20 signals available to me. No, leverage all the possible risk signals available to you. Get the most possible amount of context you can get, right, to make an authorization decision. Sometimes you'll have more, sometimes you'll have less. So that depends on the risk you're gonna, your risk judgment at that point and the trust you're gonna assign. And what this also does, it allows flexibility for your users. Because if a user says, well, I don't want to enroll in MDM, okay, I don't have that signal available to me, which means I'm going to assign you a different digital trust. And you might be able to access 7 of the 10 applications, but the other 3 require a trust that is higher than what you can accomplish with the constraints that you have put. So you either, it's not a yes or no. It's not a binary decision. You give choices, and that is the flexibility that you get from taking into context what is happening. So what will happen is that this will allow you to be more adaptive, right? And it will reduce any new introduction of undue friction, right? Because at the end of the day, we all know this, nothing kills security faster than the users avoiding friction that was introduced in the name of security. Which leads us to MFA. So make sure that your MFA, multi-factor authentication, and we specifically say multi-factor, not second factor or third factor, right? Because it could be multiple factors, and new factors are emerging on a daily basis. So make sure that your MFA is as transparent as you can make it. What does that mean? That means try to leverage as much consumerized multi-factor as available, right? So what is consumerized multi-factor? Face ID, Touch ID, right? This is available on consumer devices, and consumers are already used to it, which means it doesn't introduce friction. Make sure you support where your users are, right? Where and how they interact with your systems, not the other way around, right? Keep up with new advances in MFA. Don't implement MFA, like an old hardware token, like Wendy was saying she found in her garage, and and say, oh yeah, I have MFA, I'm not gonna worry about it ever, right? Use native solutions like WebAuthn, we heard, right? Anytime that is possible, use native solutions, use standardized solutions. And finally, reduce the reliance on password as a primary factor. Right? If you don't do anything, at least try to get to that point. So lastly, enabling zero trust, it is a team sport. It is a combined effort. It is not up to a single vendor to do so. Right? We're hearing 2 of us talk about it today, because it is not up to any single company or any single vendor to be able to give you that product or that bullet to accomplish zero trust. Google tried to do it themselves. They're still working on some aspects. It took them 4 or 5 years, and they have a huge engineering team behind it. So we obviously work with multiple partners at different places, right? We work with technology partners to make sure that the different aspects of zero trust, right, at the edge, at the middle, at the data layer, the different signals that we can get, how many more signals can be incorporated at a given time, to give you the most flexible mechanism. So in summary, make identity your control plane. That means authentication, that means MFA. Right? And because if you don't know who something is, then everything else is going to fall apart. And with that, back to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks very much, Babar. Excellent presentation. We're now going to head into our audience Q&A session, but before we do, just like to remind our audience that we have a feedback survey on our console. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could fill that out and give us your feedback on today's session. Also available are PDFs of the PowerPoint presentations. And again, you have the chance to submit a question. We'll take a few in the remaining time. Also want to point out a link, a couple of links here that will push out to our audience. One will be for also our upcoming webcast on June 18th, and we hope to see you then. Please register for that. And as we go back to our audience Q&A, we do have a number of questions. I'll start here with one early on from Kristen, who says, does bouncers versus bartenders kill single sign-on? Wendy, what is your thoughts on that?
My thought is no, it doesn't. Although it's a good concern to have. The thing is that to kind of stay with a simple analogy, if the bouncer and the bartender can talk to each other, and the bartender says, "Look, it's cool. I already saw their ID," or vice versa, then one of the resources can accept an attestation from the other one. But the other thing is that sometimes you only need a bouncer. If you're not, trying to access, if you're not trying to drink alcohol, if you're just going to the nacho table, you're never going to have to show ID. So you can use proportionate authentication and verification for your users based on what they're trying to access at the time that they're trying to access it. And you might go a whole week just accessing things with one baseline level of authentication, and when you finally need to do something privileged, you come up against another form of authentication that says, look, we're just going to have to check one more time, or we know you've been working with your personal laptop all week, but you're trying to be an ERP administrator right now, so we really need you to switch over to a corporate laptop, okay? And so this is the juggling act that CISOs do when they're setting up a zero trust model.
Okay, great. And Barbara, did you have some thoughts?
No, I second that 100%. And I saw that question and I smiled to myself when I saw that. To what Wendy was saying, think of it, single sign-on doesn't go away. Single sign-on is very important from a security perspective. It's also very important from a practicability and ease of use perspective. But think of this as the bouncer is going to put the stamp on your hand, and a different color or different stamp of the day based on your age, for example. And in which case you don't actually have to show ID again. Think of it as the derived credential or a token that you have gotten. That token is valid within that premises, right? So, we're continuing to use this analogy, but totally agree with Wendy.
Okay, great. Era has a question here. So how do you score users' trust to make a decision on whether to allow them or deny them?
Oh, I'll start with that one if that's okay.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, scoring is a very sensitive question as far as I'm concerned. Everybody has a different formula, and a lot of the problems that I have seen in the past as an industry analyst have been security products that do their scoring in a black box environment, and they don't explain how they arrived at it, which is why I'm much more in favor of organizations doing their own scoring and configuring their controls appropriately. So, for example, if you are dealing with data protection laws, you might say, look, I don't care who this person is, and I don't care that they're authenticated and they're really on this laptop. If they're coming from the United States, we can't let them into this German database. So, from that perspective, the location is the heaviest weighted factor in that decision at that time because of that reason. So I wouldn't trust a zero trust product that tried to do black box scoring for you. I would rather see a product that said, look, these are the different factors that we're able to give you visibility on. In our experience, this usually means this, but you guys decide, because it's always going to be different.
I agree with that. It's funny because we were both thinking the same way. Yes, you should look for products that give you the levers, right? They give you the score, but you get to decide the weighting and the meaning of the score. Because remember that the scoring by itself is useless. You have to act upon it. And what you do, that's the business logic that is going to act upon it. The score basically says 50. Okay, what does that mean? Well, 50 from somebody is completely different meaning than 50 from another vendor. So understanding what it means and understanding what it means to you is important, and then you apply the mitigation policy, based on that score, and that's where the two sides come together.
Okay, fantastic. Robert loves the analogies and says, we are a 3-person startup with a website that serves doctors, who are their customers, and their patients. The people accessing his website are almost all non-employees. Does any of this centralized authentication stuff apply to them?
Yes, it does. So remember that I said you externalize, centralize, normalize. So you don't always have the ability to do central authentication, and most people think that when they hear the word central authentication, it means there's a central database of all the users under somebody's control. A better word possibly is a centralized federated model, right? So what really that means is that you externalize the authentication and you federate those users into your systems. And based on what they bring to the table, this goes back to we just talked about the number of factors and the trust and everything else. You give them access and give them certain entitlements and rights to certain data elements based on the trust level they bring into the system, aka the scopes and other things they have as part of their federated identity. And you can always say, no, you need more for accessing this information versus less. So centralized authentication in this context really means a central decisioning or a centralized orchestration point that is going to take into account the different federation and different authentication that you bring to the table.
Yeah, I really feel for the person asking this question because, it is really tough when you can't fire your users. Am I right? And especially if they're doctors, with different practices and so on. But as Barbara said, you can set your security requirements for access, and that might lead you to be able to use federation. In other words, you could use, you could accept authentications from an identity store of people who were verified someplace else, let's say, a centralized hospital practice or, an insurance company. But if you are the stewards of data like HIPAA data where you have to do additional verification before you allow access, you can't just take a federated ID provider's word for it, then you're kind of stuck. And like Barbara mentioned, you can set up certain levels of security requirements that have to be met, but you're going to have to be flexible on them. If somebody doesn't have a smartphone, you may have to go with SMS-based authentication. And I know we don't like it, but it's better than nothing. So, yeah, I'm afraid in that case, where you're a 3-person startup and you serve doctors and their patients, you're just going to have to do the best that you can. Luckily, as we've been mentioning, there is enough technology there so that you can view the security state of a device even if you don't manage it and you haven't seen it before. And you can make decisions accordingly. Like you can say, this is Wendy's personal phone. We know that Dr. Wendy always accesses our site with this phone, and therefore we're going to mark it as known. And that's making an incremental improvement in your security. It's certainly not blocking every attack, but it's making things better.
Okay, fantastic. Ernesto asks, so zero trust, is that concept meaning the end of classic corporate VPNs?
The short answer is yes, but it's also a flippant answer. So I apologize for that. It means so here's what I look at it like. So with the whole work from home COVID thing, what happened was a lot of people found that their VPN infrastructure was fine for, the 10 people that used it. But all of a sudden, 6,000 or 10,000 people using that and backhauling all that traffic. They didn't, one, the VPN concentrators weren't set up for that. Two, you're backhauling all that traffic. So does VPN still have a role in Zero Trust? Yes, it does. Just like we've been saying, it's defense in depth. It's each of these elements play a role, right? But forcing everybody to go through a VPN to try to get their email or try to do, chat with their coworkers and use Slack, that goes away with Zero Trust.
Yeah, I was just going to say that since I work for Cisco, I can't say VPNs are dead, but I absolutely agree with Barbara that it depends on what kind of access you need and what you need it for. For example, if you're an administrator and you need to access an SSH into all kinds of systems, you probably need a VPN because you need that level of flexibility. But if you have a third-party contractor who only needs access to one of your corporate resources, and you're already making them use multi-factor authentication, you are checking their device and saying, look, you can't get in until you're up to date on your software, and those sorts of things, then maybe TLS is enough. So again, it's risk-based. It depends on what kind of access they need and how broadly, and you want to give them least privilege. So it's certainly maybe more desirable and easier for users to give them only as much as they need and not any more than that.
Okay, thanks. We've got time for a couple more questions. Let's take one from Eric here, who says, what key metrics or SLAs should organizations be considering when evaluating different security providers regarding Zero Trust? I'd like to take that.
I would say that the one thing to note is how flexible they are, right? Whatever, if they're because remember there are different aspects of Zero Trust, right? So you could have a privileged user access solution selling you their Zero Trust. We're selling you Zero Trust. Cisco is selling you Zero Trust. Software-defined perimeter company or network company is selling you Zero Trust. So each vendor, whatever portion of Zero Trust they are able to help you with, make sure that they are flexible, right? Make sure that they are following whatever standards are applicable in their space. Make sure that they are extensible, and make sure that they are able to grow with you and not force you to adapt to them, and they're able to adapt to your business processes. Those are the things I would look for from a key metrics perspective. SLAs are a little bit tricky because SLA normally to me it implies somebody giving you a number, and unless the only people who can give you a number are people who are selling you insurance, because they can say I'll pay me this much premium and I'll take care of you when a breach happens. So nobody's going to really give you a number.
Yeah, unless it's zero for Zero Trust. I want my Zero Trust SLA to be 0, 9 zeros. That's what we're aiming for.
I like that.
Thank you. Fed says here that it seems to me that software-defined perimeter is the best or simplest way to implement many of the Zero Trust requirements. But what are your thoughts on SDB?
I love it. We partner with software-defined perimeter vendors. I am a big fan of them. We always say you cannot attack what you cannot see. If the network is not visible to you, if the routes are not visible to you, you can't basically do probing attacks. You can't, think of it as the cloak around the invisible cloak. If you ship, from Star Trek, if you can't see it, you can't probe it. So definitely, totally agree.
Yeah, as someone who works for Cisco who provides STP solutions as well as other types of Zero Trust solutions, I would say, again, it's good to have options. It depends on what your environment can support. Let's say, for example, you don't run your own network. Then you're kind of stuck with network layer solutions, which is why I talked earlier about the new perimeter being any place where you make an access control decision. And if the only place you can make that decision is at the application layer, for example, if you're using a third-party SaaS and you don't know how your users are getting there and you don't really care because you're putting all your security right at that point of login, then that's what works for you. So I would just encourage everybody to think widely about where they can be making these zero trust access decisions and where it's going to be most practical for them.
Okay, great. Let's squeeze in one more here. Issue is some zero trust apps do not make decisions based on location. What is the benefit of making a decision on a location versus not? There is not a lot of information about compromise rates inside a network versus outside of it. And in fact, if your company is a target, then you will have more risk inside of the company network than outside. What are your thoughts on this?
Ooh, Barbara, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So Wendy talked a lot about this already during the presentation, and you're absolutely right. And the first thing we say is don't make a decision based on network locality or geolocality or anything. But if that's the only thing you have, if you have nothing else to do, right? So this is why the whole concept is a layered security approach. If you have nothing else and that's the only thing you have, then that's where you have to start. In other places, the locality actually gives you a hint of one of the variables. So a locality could give you a hint. Wait a minute, this person just logged in from San Francisco and now they're logging in from New York in the next in 5 minutes. So it could be a problem, could be a VPN, could be something else. So it gives you another variable or another thought. And the example Wendy was saying, in some instances it could be a big weighted factor, like no, you are coming from a region that I am just not going to do business with, right? Or I'm not going to push my data to. So I'm just not going to, there's no reason for me to waste time and let you probe my system. So there are valid reasons to look for it, but and sometimes if that's the only thing, then that's the only thing you got.
Yeah, agreed. And I think what we're trying to stress here is location should not be the only factor the way it used to be, that, hey, if you got through the firewall, you were home free. And we saw with, earlier, very large breaches like Operation Aurora, which compromised Google and a lot of large Silicon Valley companies simply because they were able to get in through the network perimeter and then they could move laterally. The Target breach, I know everybody mentions the Target breach, but it always comes to mind, came from an HVAC vendor who had their credentials stolen, and the attacker came in through the VPN. And once they came in through the VPN, again, they had open access, including to the point of sale network, which that HVAC vendor should never have been able to access anyway. So, we should be segmenting better inside of corporate networks, and I know that's very hard, especially with legacy networks, but we just shouldn't make it the only factor anymore, and we shouldn't assume that just because somebody started inside the network, it means that they're completely legitimate. We should check again. And so I think that's, I don't know about statistics about risks inside of the company network. We just know that checking location alone isn't sufficient anymore.
Okay, fantastic. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this session. So again, we want to remind you to please fill out the feedback form. Hopefully we'll see you at our next webcast on June 18th. And thank you all for attending today's Black Hat Webcast, a surprise trip to Zero Trust Land brought to you by Black Hat, Ping Identity, and Informa. Shortly after this live event, we'll send you an email so you can access this presentation on demand. And on behalf of our expert guests, Wendy, Nather of CISCO, our sponsor presenter, Amin of Ping Identity, we want to thank you for your time and have a great day.